Hey guys, I hope everybody had a good week and you had some time to think about the Boston Tea Party, the protest, the boycott heard around the world, which would ultimately lead up to the American Revolution. Our forefathers who came before us would win that war. They would defeat the English army, they would defeat the King of England and say, "Get out of here. We are no longer subjects to your rule and the whims of whatever you say goes. Now we are free, we are sovereign, we are the United States of America." And then a few years after that war, after that conflict, that fight between the American colonists who had previously been the subjects of England and the King of England and the English army, after the American colonists had won that war and established that they were no longer to be ruled by England, they were no longer to be told what to do by a king across an ocean, they had to establish a new government, right? Because if you get rid of one government, and for lack of a better term, let's say government is in charge of making the laws for now. And when you get rid of one government, England and the King of England, well, they had to establish another one. And after trying something with the Articles of Confederation, something we are definitely going to do a deep dive into later, but you don't have to worry about that right now. Ultimately, the colonists decided on this document right here, the Constitution of the United States of America. And this is the structure of the American government, the body of people whose job it is to make the laws, uphold the laws, that's fine for now, for lack of a better term. So they made the Constitution and they added something called the Bill of Rights. And we've covered some of these rights already. Freedom of speech, right? The ability to speak freely, to voice dissent against the people in power, to say, I have a problem with something the government is doing, without the government showing up, putting handcuffs on you and throwing you in a jail cell, right? We're able to speak freely, and we take that for, a lot of people take that for granted because they don't realize how special it is. They don't realize that there are places in the world where if you speak out against your government, you are put in handcuffs and you're put in a cell, you're put in a cage. So it's something very special. But freedom of speech and freedom to assemble, to gather together, to protest, to come together and say, I have a problem with something. So let's review. What does the First Amendment to this Constitution say? What is the first restriction that was put on the government? Let's see. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, and we're going to talk about that, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. We're going to do a deeper dive today into why it was so important to these colonists to, in the First Amendment, not only put free speech, but to add that we have a right to meet up with one another. We have a right to assemble with one another and talk about the problems that we have with the government. Because when the colonists, after they had won a war, this epic fight with the most powerful army in the world in England, they wanted to create a document that would protect them in the future, that would protect their children against a new authoritarian, a new king, a new person who wishes to tell us what to do. And they knew in order for people to have a chance to fight back against something they think is unfair, they have to be able to meet up with each other, assemble, and tell whoever that authority is, tell the government, tell the President of the United States, hey, we have a problem with something that you're doing. And that's why the right to assemble and protest and, as they word it, have a redress of grievances with the government. Say, hey, government, I have a bone to pick with you. Hey, government, I have some grievances, and you're going to hear me out. They put that in the First Amendment, and let's talk about why that was. So let's go to 1754 to 1763. This was, years before the American Revolutionary War. And at the time, the American colonists were actually partnered up with England, right? The American colonists and the English army, right, those redcoats, they fought together on the same team. They were like, hey, we're on a team, right? Yes, we're on a team. And they fought on the same team along with the help of certain Indian tribes, I believe the Mohawk Indians. They fought together on the same team against the French and other Indian tribes. So they had this fight, the French and Indian War. It lasted from 1754 to 1763, and the English army and the American colonists together, right, along with an Indian tribe, were able to defeat the French, right? They beat back the French, and they said, get out of here, get out of the United States. It wasn't the United States of America at the time, but get out of the American colonies. You are no longer welcome here. And just like that, they had won the war. Everything's peaches, right? Why would the colonists and then the King of England and the Army of England all of a sudden start butting heads? They just won the war. Shouldn't they? No? All right. Well, quick recap. So again, you had the French and Indian War, as you can see there on the left. Those are the British redcoats, and they were partnered with one Indian tribe and the American colonists, and that was their team. There's the Indians in the middle, right? And then the French on the right. And the French were also partnered with Indian tribes. So that's why the Indians in the middle here. But as you can see in the graphic, French and Indian War, essentially it was England versus France, but they were fighting over here, where we are in the Americas. So just to add a little bit of context, as you can see on the left side of the map, can you identify the United States of America? I actually wish I had a mouse, but for those of you not familiar, if you see that dotted line going across the screen, on the left side of that dotted line, the country is orange, right? That's the United States of America. That's where we are. That's where we live. Well, if you follow that dotted line all the way to the right, the end of that dotted line, that's where England is. It's all the way across the ocean, all the way to the right. At the end of that dotted line, it's touching England. So keep a mental note of where England is. And then right underneath England is France, also across the ocean. So you have France and England, who are an ocean away from us, right? We are all the way to the left at the left end of that dotted line. We're that big orange country, right? France and England are right next to each other. And they're having this fight, but they wind up having the fight over territory where we are now in the United States of America. And the colonists would help England with that fight because the colonies were subjects of England, belonged to the King of England, right? So you had the French and Indian War. Well, in 1763, in the Treaty of Paris, France, or the French, one and the same, France is the French, right, was forced to give up all of its North American colonies, including Canada and all the land west of the Mississippi River. So England and the American colonists, boom, 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 beat up the French. They ran away, but the problem was, even though they won the war, even though England won the war, the economic cost of the war was incredible. It cost a lot of money, and it left the country virtually bankrupt. Money, money, money. Anytime there is a war, it costs a lot of money. And you always have to ask yourself, who benefits financially from a war? Who funds the war? And after the war, who does the country of England owe money to? Or in a modern war, who does the United States of America owe money to? And of course, all wars are funded by the banks. And this was true back then, and it's true today. So the banks and something called Wall Street, they have immense power, but it's often not talked about. But always make a mental note. Whenever there is a war, track the money and you will get the truth, because as we learned in our propaganda class, for those of you that took it and for those of you that haven't, make sure you take that. But not everything presented to us on the news media, in schools, on television is accurate. And often the people that are really behind things are so powerful that they prevent people or these institutions from actually pointing out their power. And the banks are very important. So you had King George, the King of England, and he said, you know what? We fought alongside you, American colonists. We fought together to beat back the French, to throw them out of North America so that you don't have to worry about them. We were doing that for you. And the colonists said, we were helping you, and this was your war, and you have to pay for it. This was your war. We were just over here hanging out. And the king said, no, 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 no. You have to pay for the French and Indian War, and we're going to implement some taxes to make sure you do. Mr. King, how many times do I have to tell you? We were helping you. This was your baby. You wanted the French and Indian War, and we were just fine. And now you're trying to get us to pay for something you wanted. Well, 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 we'll see who has the power here. I'm going to tax you. I'm going to tax your sugar. I'm going to tax your stamps. Ooh, I'm going to tax your tea. We'll see how much you like that. Oh boy, here we go. We might have some disagreement. So in 1764, there was the Sugar Act, which was a tax on a few things, and among that being sugar. Right, and then there was more that went along with the Sugar Act. It involved sugar, it involved molasses being shipped imported into the American colonies, right, where the king, he actually wanted the colonists to buy the molasses. So he was like, all right, I'll make the sugar cost more money, and we'll make it more beneficial. We'll incentivize. We'll give the colonists a reason. We'll say, hey, listen, it's going to save you money if you just get the molasses, right? So there's the Sugar Act, and the king was trying to raise money to help pay for the war, among other reasons. Then in 1765, so again, just this timeline, the French and Indian War ends in 1763, right? 1 year later, 1764, I got to pay back these banks. Sugar Act. Sugar Act, we're going to tax the sugar and a few other things. 1765, the Stamp Act. Yes, the Stamp Act. We are going to tax all of your paper, right? And anytime you make a transaction that involves paper, you're going to have to pay taxes on that paper, which of course the colonists, who were pretty outraged about everything that had been going on. I mean, we know how bad it gets with the Boston Tea Party, who were pretty outraged with everything going on. They said, hey, wait a second. We don't have Twitter. We don't have TikTok and YouTube. Paper's how we communicate. How am I supposed to communicate with my friend who lives 30 minutes away? I don't have a car. No, I got to write a letter, put it on a horse, and get it over there. This is an attack on my speech as well as my wallet and my freedom and my sovereignty. Then in 1765, so we have 1763, the French and Indian War ends. 1764, the Sugar Act. 1765, the Stamp Act. 1765, the Quartering Act. And this was brazen because the king said, you know what? I don't want to pay for, we still have soldiers. We have English soldiers still over in America, and I don't want to have to pay for them to have a roof over their head and a bed to sleep in, right? So we're going to do something called the Quartering Act, and if a soldier comes to your house, you have to let them sleep in your bed and eat your food. So the colonists were like, you can imagine. Then so that's 1765. Then in 1767, the Townshend Acts, which was the initial tax on tea, among other goods. So then in 1773, the tax on tea. We have the French and Indian Wars. Look how quickly this is evolving. Hey, America! The colonies and England, we're all good friends. Everything is cordial between us. Let's go fight the French together. We beat back the French. Then we come over here, and then the king's like, hey, that was on you. You owe us some money. And the colonists were like, no, that was on you. You have to pay for the war. And he's like, no, you owe us money. Oh, you have to pay for the war. You owe us money. 1764, 1 year after the war ends, the Sugar Act. 1765, the Stamp Act. 1765, the Quartering Act, where they say, you have to let a soldier sleep in your house. And you're like, whoa, wait a minute here. 1767, the Townshend Act, which puts the first tax on tea into place, and then 1773, the Tea Act. So that leads to the Boston Tea Party, right? And that was the Boston Tea Party where the colonists, they dressed up as Indians in the night, and they're like, whoa, 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 right? They're dressed up as Native Americans, they're dressed up as Indians, they're like, all right, we're going to sneak on this ship in the middle of the night, I'll tell you right now. So they sneak up on the ship, they pick up the tea, they just pick up the tea, and pretend this is tea and not, I don't know what that is. A hippo? Is that a hippo? They take it, boom! And they throw the tea into the harbor. Over $1 million worth of tea. They got their point was made, and it pissed off England. It pissed off England. But the colonists, before it had gotten to the Tea Act, the colonists had actually been very successful in their protest, in their boycott. In fact, the Sugar Act was repealed and the Stamp Act was repealed. But the reason, or what we should understand, is that the reason that their protest, their boycott, was so effective, the reason they were able to get the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act repealed so that they didn't have to pay taxes on these things, was the way in which they lived their lives. You see, the colonists were very capable. They were skilled. They can build things with their hands. They can grow things. They can make pretty much anything, their shoes, their clothing, whatever it might be. So the colonists were very capable of living independently, and if they decided, hey, you know what, I don't want to support what this king is doing or this law or that law, right? Well, what the colonists could do is say, you know, we'll make things on our own. Don't you worry about it. Because they were farmers. They grew their own wheat and made their own bread. They cut down their own trees and built their own homes. They took care of their crops and managed their own fields. They cared for their animals. They had animals that produced eggs and milk and food. And they had a really nice Christian-based community, right? Now, we'll get into freedom of religion, and there was certainly that in the Americas, but they had a very high trust, very close-knit community of skilled people who were independent and capable of living on their own. And when you have that combination, when you have this rugged individualism of people who can build their own houses and grow their own food and weld their own metal and make pretty much anything, clothing, shoes, whatever it might be, and then you have a tight-knit community of people that trust each other, well, that is a recipe for successful protest, for successful boycott, and that's exactly what we saw. Because they made their shoes, and they made their clothing. This is the way they dressed during colonial times. And their protests were effective. There were famous weddings, right? There were weddings where the brides in the past, they would buy their wedding dresses from England, but now they were making them on their own because they didn't want to support England. And they decided they would boycott basically everything from England. They said, you want to do the Sugar Act? You want to tax us? You want to do the Stamp Act and tax us? We won't buy your tea. And they didn't buy their tea. We won't buy your wine. and they didn't buy their wine. We won't buy your clocks or your textiles, right? Your blankets, your cloths. We won't buy your diamonds. We won't buy your buttons, which at the time, and every esteemed gentleman would have a button. We won't buy your carriages. We will build our own stuff. And because of that, tremendous economic pressure was put on England. They were like, oh no, we were supposed to make money from these taxes, and instead we're losing money. And all of the businesses, right, the English businesses, they went up to the King of England and they said, can you repeal the Sugar Act? Can you get rid of the Stamp Act? Please help us out. These colonists are protesting and boycotting, and they are not buying anything. And it's hurting us. And the colonists were like, you know what? It hurts us a little bit too to not have the convenience and the luxury of buying English goods, but our freedom is more valuable than that. And the colonists were able to manufacture their own clothing and their own shoes and their own everything that they needed for the most part. And because of that, they were very successful. And the Stamp Act was thrown out. Get rid of the Stamp Act. The Sugar Act was thrown out. In fact, nearly everything was thrown out. The England said, all right, we'll get rid of those taxes. But the one thing we're not going to get rid of is a tax on tea. We're not going to get rid of a tax on tea. Because as we discussed earlier, businesses and corporations, really big ones, not like a small little business that you see, like a pizza shop that you see on the corner, but big businesses. And these are modern businesses that you're looking at. Modern, I mean businesses that exist today, right, in the world we live in. But these businesses have a tremendous amount of power. And because they have so much money, they have a lot of influence, and businesses usually play a big part in wars. There's something called the military-industrial complex in the modern world, in which there are businesses that make millions and millions and millions and millions and billions of dollars from war. And they will actually lobby or try to convince the President of the United States or people who are able to make these decisions. They'll say, hey, you know what we need? We need to go to war. We need a war, right? Well, the tea tax was put into place, or the Tea Act was put into place, because the British East India Tea Company had lobbied the King of England, and they wanted a monopoly over tea in the colonies, to the point in which they told the colonists, you're not allowed to make your own tea. Now, do you think the colonists listened to that? Well, 1773. And what do we have? The Boston Tea Party. Oh. They sneak onto the ship, get those barrels of tea, and whoop, throw them into the harbor. Millions of dollars worth of cargo, a message heard round the world. Well, the king didn't take too kindly to that, and he would pass the Intolerable Acts of 1774. And basically, he said, you know what? People of Massachusetts, the Boston Tea Party, it's Boston, Boston's in Massachusetts, so it's Boston, Massachusetts. So it was really the Massachusetts Tea Party. So the king said, oh yeah, Massachusetts, you want to have your tea party? Well, from now on, someone that I appoint directly makes all the laws, all the rules, all the regulations. They tell you what to do. And you're not allowed to assemble. You're not allowed to meet with each other. The king took over the seaports where the boats come in. He actually had the English Navy with all their powerful naval boats and their big cannons and their guns. He put them in that port and said, you take control of that port. Well, the colonies didn't like the way the king responded to the Boston Tea Party, the Massachusetts Tea Party. They didn't like the Intolerable Acts. And all of a sudden, it wasn't just Massachusetts. It was New York and Pennsylvania and Delaware and the 13 colonies. It was actually 12 there were 13 colonies at the time. Georgia didn't participate, but they had the first Continental Congress, and this is where the relations really started to really go sideways. I mean, it already had, and in the first Continental Congress, they got together these people from different states, these governors from different, not states, they were called, states back then were called the colonies. So different colonies from New York and Pennsylvania and all the different colonies, right? South Carolina. They got together and they said, all right, man, it looks like this might actually be a revolution. So let's form militias. And they said we need militias in every colony, which are basically military units, right? Basically army units, where they said, just not so formal, right? But they said we need militias. And they armed up and they got ready for what could be a conflict. And they put together a document and they sent it to the king, a redress of their grievances. They said, King, we understand that there's been escalating tensions between yourself and the people in Massachusetts. And we, the colonies, not just Massachusetts, all have a problem with the way you've handled things. So this is a redress of our grievances. And they sent this document, this redress of grievances, to the King of England. And it said, we need you to repeal, to throw out, to get rid of the intolerable acts. We need you to take your English naval ships, your boats with your cannons and your guns, and take them off our seaport, right? Give us back our seaport. Allow the people of Massachusetts to make their own laws, their own rules, their own regulations, and to allow them to have their meetings again, their assembly. Well, the King of England wouldn't have that, and he said, absolutely not. So that would eventually lead to, there would be a few events, right? But eventually there would be the Second Continental Congress. And again, in the Second Continental Congress, the colonists would reach out to the King of England again, have a redress of grievances where they put down their problems with what he was doing. They sent him the olive branch petition. So they sent him this paperwork that said, listen, if you repeal the intolerable acts and work with us, then we will restore a great friendship, great relationship between England and the American colonies. And ultimately, the king wouldn't even read their proposal. He crumpled it up, threw it on the floor, and that would lead to the American Revolution, which the American colonists would win that war. They'd boom, 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 boom. They'd win the fight. Boom, it's a fight, right? So they'd win the war, and years later, they would establish the Constitution of the United States of America, right, which would establish the First Amendment of, it's not just rights, it's assumed in the document that we have these rights. It's assumed we have freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, and freedom to petition the government for a redress of grievances. But it didn't give us these rights. It assumed we had them, and it restricted the government's ability to infringe, to restrict, to take away our rights. It said, government, you have no authority to limit our speech. We already have our speech, you can't limit it. We already have freedom of religion, you can't limit it. We have freedom of the press, we're going to talk about these things. You can't limit it. We have freedom to assemble, you cannot limit that. We have freedom to petition the government, you cannot limit that. We are born with these rights. We are endowed by our Creator, by God, by birth, by nature, with these rights. This document does not grant them. It assumes they are already there. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Based on the events leading up to the American Revolution, why do you think that the Founding Fathers thought it necessary to put into the Bill of Rights that the Congress shall make no law restricting the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances? They said, we can assemble no matter what. We can get together and we can petition the government for a redress of grievances. We can tell you, hey, government, we have a problem with you. Why do you think, after their experience, they thought it's so necessary to put these things into the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, a document that still protects you to this day? And don't get me wrong, they do violate these rights, right? These rights have been violated, they will be violated again. But this document gives us a leg to stand on in defending our rights and understanding it is a very, very powerful thing. All right, guys, this has been great. I can't wait to see you next week. We are going to talk more about the Continental Congresses and how the colonists ultimately, or why the colonists ultimately decided that they were going to split, part ways with a king across an ocean, and start what we know today as the United States of America.